Good afternoon, folks, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at some contradictions between Matthew's Gospel and John's Gospel. There's so many contradictions in the New Testament that what I want to do is kind of cross-reference them. So maybe I'll do a list of contradictions between Mark's Gospel and Matthew's, and then Mark and Luke, and then Mark and John, and then Matthew and Luke, and then Luke and John, and just kind of cover them all in that area, because if you just start, it's going to be a big pile, a big mess if you just try to look at all the contradictions at once. So we got to kind of cross-reference them. Anyway, let's jump right in. Matthew chapter 4, we're told that immediately after he gets baptized, Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness getting tempted by the devil. But in John's Gospel, chapter 2, 3 days after he's baptized, he's at a wedding in Cana. What's up with that? Is he out there in the desert starving with the devil? And then he's like, whoa, hold on, I got to run over to this wedding here and make some wine because they're running out of wine, and I'll be back. The next one, Matthew chapter 21, starting about verse 2. The disciples are told by Jesus to go out and find this donkey and a colt, two animals, and bring them to him, which is stealing. It's against the Torah. Jesus was supposed to be sinless, but anyway, that's another contradiction. A bonus contradiction. And then in John's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 14, Jesus goes and finds the animal himself, the one animal. This is one of the biggest blunders in the entire New Testament because it's a mistranslation of the Hebrew. If you go back to the Old Testament where they're getting this prophecy that Jesus is fulfilling, it's from Zechariah chapter 9, which tells us about the Messiah, who will be victorious and triumphant, but he will be humble and he will be riding on an ass, a donkey birthed or foaled by a she-ass. Okay, so it's talking about one animal being born from another animal. And the authors of Matthew take this and they totally screw it up. And they make it seem like Jesus is riding into town on two different animals. He's got one leg over the donkey, he's got the other one over the colt, and people are throwing stuff at him. Anyways, let's look at the next one here. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 12, we're told that Jesus goes in and cleanses the temple. Remember, he makes a whip of cords and throws all the tables of the moneylenders and everything and tells them to get out, and it's supposed to be a house of prayer, but you're making a den of thieves. Remember all that? Well, in Matthew's Gospel, that happens at the end of Jesus' career, right before, the Last Supper, and he gets arrested. In John's Gospel, it happens right there in chapter 2, starting in verse 13, at the beginning of his career. But then again, John's Gospel has 3 separate Passovers. Synoptic Gospels tell us that there's only one Passover mentioned. Matthew chapter 25, verse 34, heaven was prepared before Jesus goes up to heaven. But in John chapter 14, verse 2, it's telling us that it was prepared after Jesus goes up to heaven. Matthew chapter 26, verse 7, this is when he's at the house of the Pharisee or the leper or whoever it happens to be, whichever gospel you happen to believe in. They're all different. An unnamed woman is the one that pours the oil on Jesus. But in John's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 3, it says that it's Mary. Because one gospel says that the oil's poured on his feet, the other one says it's poured on his head. The next one, Matthew chapter 26, verse 8, the disciples get mad at this waste of resources which could have been used to feed the poor or something like that. In John's Gospel, chapter 12, verse 4, it's Judas is the one who gets mad. Matthew chapter 26, verse 14 through 25, we tells the story about Judas making the bargain to betray Jesus before they have the Passover meal. But in John's Gospel, this happens after they have the meal. Right there in chapter 13, starting about verse 21. Matthew chapter 26, verse 49-50. Jesus betrays Judas with a kiss. How nice. And then they seize him. But in John's Gospel, chapter 18, verse 2 onward, it tells us that Jesus steps forward himself, and there's no reason to kiss him on the cheek or any of that. Matthew chapter 28, verse 6 to 8, after Jesus is brought back from the dead and the tomb is found empty, it says that the women ran from the tomb with great joy. But in John's Gospel, they find the tomb empty. Mary goes back and tells the disciples that the body's been stolen. Who would steal Jesus' body? And she's very upset, and she's weeping after that. Matthew chapter 27, from about verse 11 to 14, they're asking him questions, Pontius Pilate, and Jesus doesn't answer any charge at his hearing. He's invoking his Fourth Amendment rights. Imagine that. But in John chapter 18, verse 33 to 37, Jesus answers all the questions that they're asking him, that Pilate's asking him. When Jesus is on the cross, chapter 27, verse 46, he asked God, "Why have you forsaken me?" Why does he have to do this? If him and Jesus, or if Jesus and God are one and the same, and the Holy Spirit, they're all the same. Why, was he asking himself, "Why have you forsaken me?" Doesn't make any sense. In John's Gospel, instead of saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" his last words are, "It is finished." Matthew chapter 27, verse 55. The women are looking on from a distance. Okay, they're off in the background there. But in John's Gospel, chapter 19, verse 25, 26, they're close enough so that they could hear Jesus talking to his mother. Matthew chapter 28, verse 9, we're also told that Jesus lets Mary Magdalene and the other Mary grasp his feet. But in John's Gospel, chapter 20, verse 17, it says that he appears to Mary and he doesn't want her touching him. Why? Because he hasn't yet ascended to the Father. Okay? Which is another contradiction right there in its own, just a few verses later, in verse 27, where they're at the house. Remember, he hasn't yet ascended to the Father, but he tells Thomas to touch him. Anyway, have a nice day. I hope you learned something.